forgiveness is hard, and especially if we are in the throes of being hurt again and again and again, it's really hard. But if they can get past, that it is so hard, I don't want to face this, and they can face working through a process of trying to forgive, it can pay, I think, some of the most dividends of many experiences that they can have in life.
Welcome to episode 45 of the Mind That You Go podcast. I'm Ricky Deriz, and today I'm joined by one of the world's leading experts in the field of forgiveness research, Everett Worthington. Everett is a Commonwealth Professor Emeritus working from the Department of Psychology at Virginia Commonwealth University and a licensed clinical psychologist. He has published over 38 books and over 440 articles and scholarly chapters, mostly on forgiveness, humility, positive psychology, marriage, family, and religion and spirituality. He has also developed the REACH forgiveness model, which is supported by more than 25 randomized trials. Everett generously gives away free self-help workbooks on practices including forgiveness, humility, and patience, which are linked in the show notes for you to download if you wish. Our conversation explores the overlap of spiritual and scientific approaches to forgiveness, dealing with injustice, overcoming grudges, ruminations, and emotional unforgiveness, empathy and cognitive biases, self-forgiveness, discerning genuine forgiveness from self-deceit, plus Everett's moving account of applying the wisdom of forgiveness following his mother's murder. Just a reminder before we jump into the conversation to please like, rate, subscribe, and share to help more people access the podcast. Enjoy. Ev, I believe that's what you prefer to
I
Everett.
do. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. A warm welcome to the podcast. It was a pleasure to share the panel with you at the Mystics and Scientists recently. And, I'm really drawn to discussing this topic of forgiveness. I really appreciate the overlap that you bring to your work in terms of the scientific and the spiritual. And I'm wondering, to begin, if you could give some background in terms of what drew you to forgiveness as a topic.
Sure. I'm a Christian, so just from the point of view of that being one of the two major values in Christianity, that led me to practice forgiveness as well as I could right away. But then in 1978, I got my PhD. And I applied for licensure as a clinical psychologist in Virginia. And my caseload was all couples. So I specialized in that because I had learned by then that I don't have the ability to deal with whole families. It's just too chaotic. And, the individuals, I got a little tired of. But the right level of stimulation was couples.
Mm-hmm.
So as soon as you start working with couples, then grudges and forgiveness become a real issue. And so I really got into this from the clinical standpoint, developed a little intervention clinically, and then in 1990 a graduate student came who was like going to be a super scientist. His name is Mike McCullough. I didn't know that then. He was just a beginning graduate student. And I handed him 7 or 8 articles that I had done in the last year and said, research is something for you, something for me. Here's what I've been working on. See if you like anything. At the last moment, we had just like days before gotten the reprints of an article on forgiveness. There was just a clinical article. So I just popped it on the top of the stack, and Mike came back and said, "This is what I want to do research on." And I'm like, okay, I don't know anything about that in terms of research, but what the hey, we'll just do it. And so then that was followed by a couple of other really bright graduate students, Steve Sandage, who's an endowed chair at Boston University right now, and Jennifer Ripley. And all of them wanted to study forgiveness, but they all had different emphases. Mike was social psychological. Steve was more psychoanalytic, and Jennifer was more couples. I was spending 3 trips to the library. That was when you had to go to the library. 3 trips to the library every week just to keep up with these really bright graduate students. And so that I finally was like, okay, maybe I ought to learn this on my own. And so we had been doing the research and but that got me really into the science of it more. And I wrote a book with Mike McCullough and Steve Sandage while they were still graduate students. I remember going to a colloquium that they did for faculty on forgiveness. And afterwards, I said, "Can you all stay around a little? I have something to tell you." And they did. And I said, "I think we ought to write a book on forgiveness." Now they're graduate students, they're like, "Can we do that as a graduate student?" I'm
Mhm.
sure, So anyway, we wrote this book, and it was sent off to the publisher in '97, I guess it was. No, it was sent off at the end of '95, and at any rate, in '96, my mother was murdered, and so that kind of challenged me to take the science that I had, the spirituality that I had, the clinical experience that I had, and really apply that in a way that I had not anticipated I would ever have to apply.
Mm,
So all of those, that kind of confluence really cemented me into studying forgiveness.
mm,
And I was just blessed to be invited by the government of South Africa in the beginning of 1996 to come over and be a visiting scholar on behalf of the South African government. And that let me speak about forgiveness to universities, 8 universities, and on national television, and then to meet with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was just having its first hearings on human rights at that
mhm,
point. So by the time I was flying back from that experience in June, I had pretty much crystallized and refocused my entire way of thinking about my research program. And on the plane back, formulated a life mission, which is to do all I can to promote forgiveness in every willing heart, home, and homeland. And
mm.
that's really been my life mission ever since.
Thanks so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to unpack from that sharing. What for you was like the big difference in terms of that original religious Christian background and you could say the concept, but also the practice of forgiveness and how you related to forgiveness then compared to what your research work with clients and absolute dedication to that as a subject, what that revealed. Did it feel like there was a big difference between the two, or was it a case of it kind of went full circle back to the other?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I've always felt that the two approaches are very complementary to each other.
Hmm.
So, although there's not much science on religious approaches to promoting forgiveness, religions have been practicing this for 2,000 years,
Hmm.
and so there is a lot of common wisdom that has really built up in terms of, how do we help people who want to forgive more easily? And this involved things like prayer and meditation and scripture study and scripture, repetition and then pastoral counseling and the community drawing around the person and helping them. And so there are all of these practical ways that people had been practicing both in Christianity and Islam, and and the Eastern religions, not not as much, but and it's kind of framed differently in
Mm,
the Eastern religions, so it's not, or like Buddhism and the Eastern philosophy, so it's not really treated as much as forgiveness as it is a more disengagement, ability to quiet the ego, things like
mhm,
so. Uh, so anyway, that's kind of the way that I saw it. Very complimentary. A lot of people from just my life in studying the psychology of religion. So, I was doing a lot of research on psychology of religion and looked at different religions. And, I found that, well, people have these very deep religious and spiritual views, and yet a lot of people still struggle
mm,
with being able to forgive. And I looked at the science end as something that could be consistent with religious and spiritual approaches, but do it in a different way that maybe people who struggled, could then say, oh, well, there's a tool that I can use that, is like other tools that I've tried in terms of
mhm.
prayer or meditation or whatever.
Would you say that there generally it's because there's less emphasis on the psychological aspect of it, and I guess that's where a lot of the complexity is compared to like those practices such as like contemplation, prayer, and maybe less psychological, whereas the science kind of adds that understanding of the
Does
complexity.
Yeah, I think it does, but if you think about just a community of people coming together for support, or
Hmm.
you know, counseling from someone wise, within a religious community, you get a lot of practical psychology there.
Hmm.
So it's not such a split between the two of this is spiritual, this is psychological. They kind of, meld into each other in some kind of not very bifurcated way.
Was yeah. With because I wonder as well, and something I notice within myself is if, and I get you mentioned like the word ego, and I guess if the spiritual ego develops around the concept of I should be forgiven, then that can also solidify and become ironically a barrier to forgiveness because it almost creates like an expectation, an impatience towards the process. It just in my experience, I'm not sure if that's something that you can relate to in terms of the almost like taking the concept of it and relating to the concept rather than fully practicing it and embodying it.
Yeah, I not only study forgiving other people and divine forgiveness, the experience of feeling that God forgives us, or, that I'm in tune with the sacred, but also self-forgiveness.
Mm,
And, there can be a lot of self-condemnation that can come about because a person says, well, I really should forgive this person for murdering my, brother, but I don't. And I
mm,
can't seem to no matter what. And what's wrong with me? And then it becomes very much of a rumination, which can block all kinds of progress in terms of forgiving oneself, and also, getting on with forgiving the person that maybe murdered the person's brother.
mm. With because I know you mentioned that you use the word grudge, and I guess it would be crucial for us to attempt to define forgiveness. And also, I'm interested in how you define forgiveness, but
Uh-huh.
also what you would view as its opposite, because I find that it tends to be a duality a lot of the time with certain practices, that there is not, and again, it's not binary, but there can be some sense of its opposite. Would you be able to define those two in your understanding?
Sure. So, because I can almost recite definitions in my sleep, I'll start with the easy question. So, we look at forgiveness, in the people that I do research with, and I would say I'd say a majority of people who study forgiveness scientifically have now decided to talk about two different types of forgiveness. So one and both of these are valid, and they
Hmm.
are, it turns out when you measure them, correlated only at zero point 0.4, which means only 16% of shared variance,
Hmm.
which means they're fairly independent of each other, So, but one of them is what we call decision to forgive. And this is a decision to treat the person who is the offender differently, to treat them as a more valued and valuable person. So, so this is not a behavior. This is a behavioral intention.
Hmm.
So there's a big difference because I could make a decision to forgive someone and they get hit by a car tonight. I never get to practice that. Does that mean I'm holding a grudge all my life? No,
Hmm.
not
Yeah.
really. I have made that decision to forgive. It was a behavioral intention. Or I make this behavioral intention statement. The person immediately deeply offends me again. Well, my feelings, pop up immediately as being, oh, I hate this person. This is just like they always do. Did I not forgive them? No, I did forgive them. It was a decision, it was a legitimate decision. Now I have to make a new decision about
Hmm.
this new offense that's happened. So I can make this decision to forgive, but still feel these emotions of resentment and bitterness and hate and aggression and anger and anxiety about being hurt again. So this complex set of emotions, like a ball of multicolored yarn that's all wound up, mixed up with each other, and we look at that yarn and we say, well, that's unforgiveness. So I can have emotional unforgiveness, even though I made a decision to forgive. And that suggests there has to be some kind of second process that is emotional forgiveness.
Hmm.
And so emotional forgiveness is replacing those negative, unforgiving emotions with more positive, other oriented emotions, such as empathy and understanding for the person, compassion for the person, sympathy, love for the person, even, in a case of let's say, a married couple that, you know, are at war with each other. Well, they could rekindle love and undo a lot of that negativity. So, so there are two types, I think, of forgiveness. If we look at the opposite, I think it's often not helpful to look at the opposite because I'd rather look at alternatives to dealing with injustices.
Hmm.
So forgiveness is one way of dealing with an injustice.
Hmm.
But there are many legitimate ways to deal with an injustice, such as relinquishing it to God or turning it over to God for divine, zapping, or pursuing justice or seeing justice done, seeing a person get the natural consequences of what terrible thing they've done, uh, tolerating it. I'm just going to put up with this, forbearing, which is basically tolerating for the good of the relationship, accepting and moving on with life. there are many different, and there are a lot of cognitive ways we can deal with it too. But there are many alternatives to dealing with injustice other than forgiving. So forgiveness is one of a suite of ways that we can walk into and deal with that injustice. And of course, they're not mutually exclusive. I could turn it over to God, but also, practice forgiving. I
Hmm.
could, see justice done. I could see the person grovel and apologize to me, but still not feel that my emotions are totally, taken care of. And so I can, practice emotional forgiveness. So, but there certainly are opposites like unforgiveness, holding on to emotional unforgiveness.
Mm.
And unforgiveness is probably a combination of some kind of resentment and avoidance motivation, and
Hmm.
combined with some kind of vengeful motivation, and kind of anger and hate and all those that ball of yarn, if you will. And so there are those, opposites. And we did a meta-analysis of research on um, sex or gender and forgiveness. And I thought the results were really interesting. We found that, I mean, you might have your own hypotheses about who it practices vengeance more often,
Hmm.
whether it's men or women. It turns out men practice vengeance and vengeful motivations 4 times as often as
Oh,
women.
wow.
However, holding grudges and resentment and kind of negative, I'll get even in some kind of backhanded way. Well, women twice as likely to do that as men.
Hmm.
Now, on both cases, I mean, there's a normal curve. So there are men that are much more grudge holding, and there are women that are much more vengeful. But this is on the average, which is science. What science does, of course, is average things out. So in terms of who's more forgiving, women slightly, not very much, but
Hmm.
women tend to be a little more forgiving than men.
Lots of questions are coming up, and I'm just relating this to my experience as well.
Yeah. So let me just kind of unpack that women these gender differences, and it's important to look at the within group differences versus the between group differences. So
Hmm.
if you think about this, who's taller, men or women? Well, on the average, men are taller by about 3 or 3.5 inches than women. But within the men's group, you've got people who are 7'3" and people who are 5'10".
Hmm.
So the difference within men is much greater than that between group difference. The same is true for women. You have women that go from 4'10" to, you know, 6'3" or 4". So so again, we don't want to make too much out of these averages that compare groups, but
Of
it's
course.
kind of fun to think about.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good comparison and like metaphor to understand. I find, especially like myself, like I'm not don't have that scientific background, and a lot of time data, you realize how much it can be skewed if you don't know how to interpret it, and those even how like the comparison of data can transform you at the original context. That's a whole other tangent. um, so there's a lot coming up for me and surfacing around this because I'm really interested just with like my personal experience and struggles. Um, something that comes to mind is around the relevancy, because you mentioned injustice and some quite extreme examples, like the example you gave, like with your mother, like really as intense as it gets, really, in terms of injustice, and other examples where it can be very clear, that injustice. In terms of forgiveness and its relevancy, how does it relate to situations where the sense of injustice might be colored or skewed by personal interpretation? And what I mean by that is, for example, if there's a sensitivity, like if I'm sensitive, if I've got a particular trigger about something, and I perceive the injustice as bigger than it is, in terms of the actual practice, is that something that is relevant, or is it actually a case of, as long as as long as that feeling's there, just do that kind of, like, follow that track and it will have benefits, if that makes sense as a kind of line of inquiry?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a fair amount of research done by the Roy Baumeister on this over the years. And what he will do is he will put people uh, in a room in which they observe uh, a discussion of a wrongdoing.
Mm-hmm.
So this is let's say a mate that's wronged the other mate, and they talk about it for a while, and people observe this. Now, the people have been handed a note, and it says one of three things. It says, listen more from the point of view of the wrongdoer, or listen more from the point of view of the victim, or it says try to be as impartial as you can. And it turns out that as people listen to these, the ones who are listening from the point of view of the wrongdoer will remember, much more things like, well, he apologized. He actually got tears in his eyes as he talked about this. He seemed really sorry.
Mm,
This was a one-time thing. It was done. It was over. And then the people who are listening from the point of view of the victim is like, well, his apology didn't seem that sincere, and yeah, he had tears in his eyes, but he's probably trying to manipulate her, and or him, and so they see things differently.
mm,
And so, the idea that there is an objective way to see an actual human wrong
hmm.
is like, well, there may be, but we don't know how to
Yeah,
do that,
yeah.
And so we know that the people who look at it from the point of view as objective as I can fell in the middle of those groups in terms of misremembering things.
Mm,
So both sides, all three sides misremembered things.
wow.
But they selectively misremember things that were to the benefit of whatever point of view they were looking at.
Yeah.
So, so basically, if you have, a real wrong that you're dealing with in life, it's really helpful to remember that I may think I remember this 100% perfectly. Realistically, I probably don't. And maybe I ought to try to practice a little humility here
Mm,
with what she says or he says versus what I remember, and not be so sure that I am remembering perfectly and they are just skewed in their memory. Uh, so probably, we're both making mistakes, and we're making mistakes that make us look in the best light possible. So self-interested mistake.
yeah. Yeah, that is a fascinating study as well, or like the confirmation bias that can come from that.
Yeah.
Um, and it demonstrates why that level of empathy of like putting oneself in the perspective of the other. I do that quite habitually, and I try to do it as a practice. But sometimes, like with my partner, I find that because I do it so habitually, actually at times it can be misinterpreted as like a as point scoring, which is not my intention. But it's almost like I have it is, I guess it is like an injustice, whether you call it a wound or like just a vigilance around it for whatever reason. That's not something to necessarily unpack now, but this feeling of, okay, if what does it look like if the roles are reversed? And this is probably more appropriate to that kind of relationship where there's a lot of, high level of attachment, a lot of sensitivity, um, a lot of vulnerability as well. But often I find myself when if I get defensive and triggered, and then I feel like I'm being viewed in a certain way. I might say, but what about, is it not the same as this? And I know that's probably not skillful, but it's like an attempt to say kind of that reflection. And it's the same the other way around. I try and do it, not just in that relationship, but in general. Like, are there times when I've done that, even if circumstantially they look different? Is the core the same? It has varied results. It's not very scientific. Sometimes it's more of a reactive pattern, but I think there is really a lot to be said about empathy and that bridge. I'm wondering if you're okay to talk about like the incident with your mom,
Yeah.
and to go into that. That is such a profound example of, I would imagine the majority of people would really struggle to empathize in that situation. How did you arrive at that in that moment, or through that process, and what did you draw upon in that moment?
So, let me just preface this by saying I don't look at myself as being some kind of uber forgiver. Uh, I had a professor who gave me a B, and it took me 10 years to forgive this guy, and a religious experience, I might add. So, I'm not like just going to quick to jump into it, but in that particular case, I was able to forgive the young man, very quickly. And that's totally, in my experience, totally unusual. So, but all events are individual events in the end. So I had just written that book with the graduate students on to forgive is human. The argument we made was this is not a religious experience. It's like knowledge, or it's all kinds of things that are just human
Hmm.
experiences. And so we had kind of developed this prototype of the reach forgiveness model that since then has had like 30 randomized controlled trials on it. So it's very effective. But at that point, we had started to study it in the first paper was published on that model in 95, which means we're studying about 93. And we had done a big study on it. So I had a kind of a prototype of this REACH progression. So this is, anytime a clinical scientist says, well, this is our intervention, we're not talking about how people do this in real life.
Mm.
We're talking about a particular way of thinking through things that leads your thinking and emotions down a particular pathway, and have been shown, if it's evidence-based, to get most people to arrive at the place they wanted to arrive at when they started down this road. So, uh, so I, started I mean, at one point I was really super angry that night. We had been all day in this murder investigation, and they had taken us over to the house that I grew up in,
Mm,
and it was trashed, and there was blood on the walls and on the floor, and so it was a very emotional experience. But of course, the police are coming in and they're interviewing everybody and kind of treating everybody as if they were the suspect,
mm,
So you're going through all this. So my wife, my brother and sister and I got together that late that night and were talking, kind of put together the story. And it looked like it was a young guy, or maybe more than one, who had broken into the house with the intent to rob. It was New Year's Eve night. They saw this darkened house because my mom had gone to bed early. They probably thought, oh, these people are out at a New Year's Eve party. She
mm,
didn't drive, so there was no car in the driveway. So, oh, these people are not home. We can just waltz in there and steal anything we want and be gone long before midnight. And so so they broke in, and then my mom was asleep, and so she eventually woke up and was bludgeoned with a crowbar that the guy had used to break the window. So, so the first step in this, kind of protocol that we had developed, uh, I had been really angry, and after kind of raging all night and literally walking around the bed hundreds of times,
mm,
just being angry at whoever did this, uh, I finally, about 3 o'clock in the morning, decided I need to stop this, non-productive raging and just do something productive. So I sat down to write a eulogy for my mom. I was the oldest son, oldest child, and and so I was in the midst of writing this eulogy, thinking through what does a woman kind of life does a woman have who has never been over 100 miles from home except being in World War II as an Army
mm,
nurse? And, and as I thought about that, I thought, I have not thought about the F word, forgiveness, that
mm,
F word, uh, all day. And here I am, this clinician who helps people forgive, this researcher who studies forgiveness, this Christian who practices forgiveness. But nope, I've just been raging about catching this guy and putting him in jail for the rest of his life. And so I thought, well, I really ought to think about this. And so then I started to work through that model. And the R is recall the hurt, but try to recall it in a way that doesn't just rehearse all the negativity. And so that is E, to empathize, to think what it might have been like for him. And so as I was recalling this, I'm thinking what might have been like to be in the winter time in, Knoxville, Tennessee, and he's hiding outside this house, looking at this darkened house, thinking he's going to create a perfect crime. This is going to be easy. And then he breaks in and is confronted by this woman, this older woman, and he's thinking she's spoiling my perfect crime. So he's angry. She's looking at my face. I'm probably going to go to jail, you know, and he's got impulse control problems and he's holding that crowbar
mm,
and he just lashes out. And so by thinking through what it might be like for him, you know, I arrived at that place where I kind of had a feeling of what he might have thought. I don't know what he thought, but I'm kind of projecting this imagined thought process into his head. And then, I flash back to earlier that night where I'd been talking to my brother and sister, and I pointed to a baseball bat against the wall and said, I wish he were here. I would take that baseball bat and I would hit him in the head till
Mm,
he died. And I thought, well, here I am. At that point, I was like 40, 48 or something like that years old. And I thought, here I am, this Christian who's 48, who's a psychologist, clinical psychologist. And I've had all day to process this. And I'm willing to pick up a baseball bat and hit him in the head. You know, I probably don't need to judge him for his spur of the moment, response where he's afraid and angry. And, that allowed me to be able to forgive him, um, which, I knew very well because, I'd studied forgiveness by that time for probably 6, 7 years, but I plus used it clinically. But I just knew that forgiving the person is something I do inside my skin. That doesn't have an impact on justice.
mm,
If he's caught, he still will face the penalty of the law.
mhm,
So this is not about, relieving him of his responsibility for doing this. This is about, dealing with my sense of hatred and resentment and anger toward him. And so, I was able to forgive him at that point in an emotional way and to make a decision to forgive him.
mm.
So,
Thanks for sharing that. I
yeah,
appreciate you sharing that. Um, it's such a powerful, it's a remarkable, example of that. Um, in that, if again, like if you're not comfortable with me asking these questions, and we
that's
can shift
fine.
the topic. I'm so fascinated by and this is just coming from me because I know you gave the example of the professor. I won't share too much right now because it's still ongoing, but a few months ago, two of my family members were attacked quite viciously. And I can share, like, I had a very similar experience to you where I was like, I'm kind of glad I'm not in Bristol right now because I don't know what I do, like just overcome with rage, really profound feelings of rage. So the one aspect that strikes me is that in that moment you had you got to that place of collectedness to then bring in that rationality to do the process, which I think I did eventually. It's obviously not a comparable situation, but I know for me that the intensity of emotion can be really hard to kind of work through. And I wonder, in that process, was it a case of the emotion, like through that forgiveness, the color of the emotions changed, or the like how did that kind of click into place in that moment? Was it a case of I can let go of that aspect of it because it's causing me harm? I know from my background, from my research, and from my practice, it is not a replacement for that sense of justice. But really, I'm really curious to that, how that, as an internal experience, shifted when you had that kind of aha moment of, oh, I can forgive in this situation.
No, no, I think uh, I don't remember. So
Mm,
that's the short answer to that. But I do know that after that, I was able to go to sleep for the rest of the night. So I didn't feel the same, rage and rumination again and again. And we've got to get this guy, and how dare he do this? So I clearly was able in some way to at least turn down the volume enough to where I could go to sleep.
mm,
course, it was 3 o'clock by then, and I'd been up since like 6. So I was tired. So my body was helping me go to sleep, where earlier, the emotions were keeping me
Hmm.
full of adrenaline. So,
Yeah.
uh, yeah. So, but I don't remember how my thoughts and feelings progressed, because I just kind of, okay, I can forgive him. Um, I hope he gets caught, but I forgive him.
Mm.
And I think one interesting thing that happened is both my brother and sister independently, within a month, both came out saying publicly that they had forgiven this person.
Mm.
And we took a lot of kind of criticism from that in our interpersonal life. It's like, how can you forgive somebody who does such a terrible thing? And we all had the same answer, when we put our heads together. And the answer was, but that's what Mama taught us to do.
Mm.
She taught us to forgive. So if we had not done that,
Mm.
that would have been dishonoring to her,
Mm.
and so we responded to what she would have wanted, and all of us both, believed the same thing, that was what she, would have wanted.
Mm. Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful sharing. It makes me think as well, like there can be the illusion of power in not forgiving. It can feel more empowered, even though it's not, to be angry and to be vengeful. Like talking from my experience, it has the illusion of being from the misconception of it, not the reality of it, but this misconception of that being a form of weakness somehow, even though it's actually the opposite. It seems to take a lot more strength to break that circuit and to it's just a huge, huge thing to forgive in those situations
And
and overcome that.
certainly the anger and the resentment is evolutionarily, the emotion that helps us remove blocks to what we want.
Mm.
So, the emotion of the moment is making us feel powerful, like we can remove the block here. Well, but realistically, I couldn't catch this guy ever, but
Mm.
because I'm not a police investigator, so that's a kind of a false emotion. It's experienced as real, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not really something that's built on any kind of truth.
How, and I guess as an extension of that, more generally based on your research, how what pointers are there or what kind of internal cues are there between the forgiveness process being one that is really like kind of doing its work, but there's almost like an alchemy to it. It's having an effect on the heart and spirit as well, compared to trying to rush forgiveness and then suppressing stuff. Because I know I've definitely experienced that where
Yeah.
often it's intellectually like the other side from earlier was where it feels like the injustice is bigger than it is. And I think I can also have, and I'm sure it's fairly common, a feeling of maybe I shouldn't feel so hurt by this. So I kind of rush to forgiveness. How do you kind of start to understand that delicate balance between those two?
No, I would say that's almost impossible for us to discern, because our unconscious mind is such that we're so good at fooling ourselves. So I can think, like, of course I forgive this person, but
Okay.
uh and so, I find that, and so as I examine my own experience, I've always felt like that was a sincere forgiveness. People will look and say, oh, that was within 24 hours. That can't possibly have been real. Well, I think it was. I think it was completely real. Uh, on the other hand, if I had taken months, you know, and got to a place, I could get there to where I say, I don't want to deal with this anymore. I haven't forgiven,
Mm,
but I've kind of disengaged my emotions. So I look like I've forgiven, but I haven't. So we can't judge other people's experience. And because we fool ourselves so well, we can't really judge our own experiences
mm,
often. I think what we do is we treat it at at face value for how I'm if I'm trying to feel do it did I really forgive? I treat it at face value, and then I have to be alert to if this keeps coming back without provocation,
yeah.
then maybe I didn't forgive. Maybe I should work on this a little more. Now, having said that, uh, suppose that I have had a really sincere experience of forgiveness, and it's my boss that's a jerk, and so and then on Monday morning, I walk in and I see my boss. I guarantee you, if I have been, angry and upset and hurt by my boss for a long time, regardless of how genuine my forgiveness, I will feel anger.
Mm,
And
mhm.
it is because my body is conditioned to that experience. Stimulus response.
Yeah.
I respond with anger. Uh, Anger is a response to pain. I know I cook breakfast and have for 50 years, but we've got this demon cabinet up above the stove, and when I don't pay attention to it, it keeps open on its own and comes out. Sometimes I will be cooking and I'll raise up and it will hit me right in the head, and I don't have a lot of padding up there to ease the pain. And my response to that is totally predictable. I will punish that door. You know, there is a pain and anger, you know,
Yeah.
and response. And that's what happens if I've been hurt, I have a pain and distress conditioning, and I have a pain and anger conditioning. And both of those are happening and are part of my experience whenever I see that boss, that stimulus again.
Mm,
So, so if I feel like I've had a very, real and substantial forgiveness experience, and I walk in and I see that boss and I feel, you know, what's he gonna do today?
yeah.
You know, I need to say to myself, I've forgiven him. That is my body doing what my body is supposed to
Mm,
do, which
hmm.
is to protect me in cases where I've been hurt before and I might be hurt again. And
Oh, yeah.
we have this discernment problem of, is it real forgiveness, or I mean unforgiveness, that I haven't dealt with, or is it conditioned anger and fear and
Mm,
anxiety about being hurt again that actually is something different than unforgiveness?
yeah.
So it's just like time will tell. If it keeps coming back, if my boss keeps hurting me, I'll have other things to deal with. But if the boss never hurts me again, but I keep on responding, it's probably unforgiveness
Yeah.
and not just a conditioned response.
Yeah, that is a great example and very insightful because I think for me there is that association with, well, if I've forgiven fully, emotionally, then I won't feel those difficult emotions. But it makes so much sense that there is that conditioning, and like you say, time will tell, like over time.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, because forgiveness isn't condoning, if there are the violation of boundaries and stuff like that, then yeah, it's just muddy and complex, isn't it?
Yeah, there will be new things to forgive. It's
Yeah.
new every morning.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Ev, how are you doing for time? We're coming up to the
I-
hour.
I'm okay. I don't have anything scheduled at 10. What's going to happen? I'm sorry to do this real time, but at 10, we're having a loss of power in our university to test emergency response.
Okay.
So
Okay.
at 10, things will probably shut down.
Okay.
I don't know
That's
if
good.
it'll happen exactly at 10, that we
Okay.
got the email saying,
Yeah, that's good to know because I'll round this up. I mean, I've got many more questions. Maybe another point we could talk again because
that'd be good.
yeah, it's super insightful and just so valuable.
Yeah.
I think it is. I know you also look at the culture and you mentioned like the work that you've done in terms of institutional forgiveness, like political, all this kind of stuff as well.
Yeah.
Um, I wonder if, and we're against the clock, you might just disappear if the power goes.
It might
Um,
not go off exactly at 10. So,
we'll see. If not to put you on the spot, but like if you could share with someone that's struggling with forgiveness, someone that is just really struggling, maybe they're also struggling with the fact they're struggling. So they're kind of frustrated that they're struggling with forgiveness. What would you say to them to start that process, to kickstart that process of forgiveness?
yeah, I would hope that they would not continue to punish themselves for being unwilling to forgive. So, uh, I mean, it's hard. Forgiveness is hard. And
Mm,
I think it can be one of the hardest things that we do in life. I remember I taught a course in positive psychology for about 10 years at VCU before I retired. And I had this homework assignment that I called View Virtue in Every Week. And so they had to do an exercise every week. And so then at the end of the semester, I asked them all, what was the best exercise that you did? And overwhelmingly, people would say the same thing, and that is the gratitude, the expression of gratitude. So this is not feeling gratitude, but this is writing a letter to someone that you're grateful to, and then either going and telling them the contents of the letter personally, or calling them up or visiting them and reading it. And that expression of gratitude was a powerful experience for people,
mm,
and they really liked it. But at least as many people who said that was the most said forgiveness, and they would say the same thing. And so they worked through that little workbook that we had on forgiveness, but they would say, at first, this was really hard and I hated it.
mm, mm,
Why do I have to do this? At the end of the semester, though, I'm thinking that was the most profound experience I had. It's hard,
mm,
forgiveness is hard. And especially if we are in the throes of being hurt again and again and again, it's really hard. Um, but if they can get past, that it is so hard, I don't want to face this, and they can face working through a process of trying to forgive, it can pay, I think, some of the most dividends of many experiences that they can have in life,
mm.
especially if it's a big one. I'm just struck by it. You mentioned Bristol. Are you from Bristol,
I
Doris?
am. Yeah.
Did a University of West,
England.
yeah, of West England, visiting scholar position there. But
Ah,
you
cool.
mentioned that, you had relatives there that had been harmed.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads to what's called third person forgiveness. That is, and this was really, you know, researched by a colleague of mine here at VCU, Jeffrey Green, social psychologist. But he found that third person forgiveness, where somebody you love has been hurt,
Mm-hmm.
can be a lot harder to forgive than they are experiencing.
Oh, wow.
So, but it's because you don't have the same first person experience, and
Mm,
you're like, they hurt my brother, my sister, my father, my mother, my son, whatever. And so, I mean, that I just think is important.
mm,
Well, I got off on a tangent there. So I'd hope that people, would be able to not judge themselves, because this is a really hard thing, and it's going to require a lot of courage to face up to it. And when we're feeling hurt and vulnerable is often not when that courage rises to the top. Sometimes that hurt has to subside before it can
mm,
decide to seize the moment here and try to forgive. And then we do have that little workbook that is free at reach.discoverforgiveness.org, which has been shown it takes 3 1/3 hours to complete on the average. And it has been shown in a trial, a randomized control trial in 5 countries, 6 sites, 40, almost 4,598 people,
mm,
that this produces forgiveness, reduces depression, reduces anxiety, produces a sense of flourishing, helps people sleep better, you know, be more forgiving as a personality trait, so there are just many benefits that come out of that, spending 3 hours to
mm.
complete a workbook. So that would be something to try. It's not a panacea. It's just a workbook,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know, and but it certainly can have an impact if people are willing to conscientiously work through it.
yeah. I'm going to.
Yeah.
I've looked at
The,
it. Yeah, I'm
the,
going
the
to.
the other thing that we found from our research is time really matters, but
Mm,
it's time spent conscientiously trying to forgive.
mm-hmm.
So, the old uh, regression line that connected all intervention studies basically said that, the more the longer you try, the more you forgive. Uh, you in that old regression line, which was built on 4,400 participants, we just did 4,600 participants. There's going to be a new line,
Mm.
because we got in 3 1/3 hours what people got in 10 hours in the old,
Oh, wow.
group. So that's a powerful little workbook. But the truth is still, more time is going to deepen the forgiveness. And I think that's something for people to keep in mind. It's like, oh, I'm going to work through this workbook and then I'll be fine. And probably not. It
Yeah,
was a deep hurt, but it's going to really help.
yeah. It's almost like you mentioned, just setting that intention is the often the beginning of that kind of time bound process, and that process can actually be delayed if stuck in resentment and kind of holding on to that. Um, Ev, thank you so much for this conversation.
Yeah,
I've loved
totally,
it.
Rick. Yeah,
I'm going to take so much away from it, and I'm going to do the workbook. I'll put links in the show notes, and share those resources as well, and I'll update you with how that goes.
great. And if you want to talk again, and we can kind of broaden it out, that you know, the kind of the deeper societal
Yes.
tensions that we have, which are many, it seems
Yeah.
like, in every country.
Yeah, I'd love to do that because you
Yeah.
also, yeah, so you mentioned like complex adaptive systems and
Yeah.
forgiveness and all this kind of, interesting stuff to explore. So Yeah, I'd like to do that another time. That'd be great.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Mind That Ego podcast. To stay up to date, you can join the Mind That Ego mailing list if you head to mindthatego.com/MFM. You'll also get a copy of my book, Mindsets for Mindfulness, when you join. You can also follow Mind That Ego on Facebook and YouTube, where the podcasts are also displayed in video format along with other inspired videos that I create. Or if Instagram is more your social media of choice, you can follow me at Ricky_Deriz. That's DERISZ.